How we doing? Let's get back to it, shall we? So just to kind of clean up a little bit of work from the last lecture, Wilson's 14 points. This is what I mean by that paragraph about universal nationalism. So when you read this on your own, be especially looking at for this paragraph and just sharing your thoughts about it. We entered this piece because violations of right had occurred, which touched us to the quick and made the life of our own people impossible unless they were corrected, and the world secured once and for all against their recurrence. What we demand in this war, therefore, is nothing peculiar to ourselves, and we have no national interest in this war. It is that the world be made fit and safe to live in, and particularly that it be made safe for every peace-loving nation which, like our own, wishes to live its own life, determine its own institutions, be assured of justice and fair dealing by the other peoples of the world as against force and selfish aggression. All the peoples of the world are effect partners in this interest, and for our own part, we see clearly that unless justice be done to others, it will not be done to us. The program of the world's peace, therefore, is our program, and that program, the only possible program as we see it, that introduction of subjectivity in there, as we see it, after some really bold statements, is this, and then hence the 14 points. Now you might be wondering what was that business about the mandates on the last slide. So the mandate system was set up during the peace program at Versailles. The idea of the mandate was the imperial powers would kind of establish a new partnership with their colonized peoples. These mandates would be, yes, like Britain, France would still be in controlling other parts of the world, control their empires, but they were under a mandate, if you will, to begin transferring power, to begin issuing the kind of tutelage or parentage, if you will, to bring people. I think the mandate system in the treaty said that the people who would be under mandates were people who were not ready for the pressures of the modern world. It's very patronizing language, frankly. But the idea of the mandates is that the European powers would help bring these other peoples, these decadent peoples, as Conan had called them, bring them into conditions where they're ready to stand up under the modern world. Some have said the mandate system was imperialism by other means. I'll leave you to judge that for themselves. This is ultimately where a lot of the mandates took place. France, for instance, was given a mandate in Syria. England was given a mandate in Iraq and in Transjordan. Palestine there was part of the British mandate as well too. The question to ask would be, as Wilson is saying, this peace program is the best possible program. Was the mandate system, these regions of the world remaining under European control, was that what these countries ultimately desired? I will say that several of them thought that Woodrow Wilson would actually his language in point 5. They thought that Wilson would actually support the freedom of these areas from British and French imperial control. Ultimately, that's not what the Americans did. We ultimately kind of let England and France pursue their mandate system. And how successful were the French and the British at helping bring these peoples into the modern world? I'll leave that for you to decide, or maybe we can talk about that in class. But we need to really shift our focus now in the lecture. So we've talked really about kind of the international dimensions of World War I, but we want to talk about how did World War I change the United States at home? What were some of the changes that were brought about in the United States as a result of World War I? And that's another way of answering that question is, how did World War I change the progressive movement? Because it's not like progressivism, as we've talked about it last week, it's not like that suddenly just went away because we're at war. In some ways, the progressive movement had become more advanced, even more nationalized during these years, right? The elections of 1912, in which Wilson won, had seen the emergence of the Progressive Party under Teddy Roosevelt, and many people thought that Roosevelt and the Progressives would try again in 1916. So progressivism remained a powerful force in American life. And so the question is not just how did World War I change America, but how did World War I change progressivism? So as we go through these couple of topics here in over the next few several minutes, let's consider how did World War I change the meaning of progressivism? How did it fulfill progressive ideals? How did it maybe run counter to them? Let's first talk about economic changes brought about by American involvement in the war. Progressivism had been in part about the government's engagement in the enlightened or scientific management of the economy, right? Progressives like Teddy Roosevelt believed the government needed to play a more active role in regulating the economy and regulating the economy in ways that would make it, not just more just, but in some ways more efficient as well, too. We needed to take these forces of interdependence and try to get a kind of humane scientific control over them. Well, in that sense, World War I seemed to confirm the progressive ideal that government can manage the economy and accomplish a purpose, in this case, the purpose of winning World War I. When the United States entered World War I, we issued a series of legislation, the Lever Food and Fuel Control Act. You see that key word of progressivism, control, there. The government assumed, under Herbert Hoover, control of America's food and fuel supplies with the idea of limiting domestic consumption of food and fuel so that we could supply our armed forces, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, but also provide more food and fuel for our allies in this conflict. And for all intents and purposes, Hoover and the Lever Control Act was an amazing success. So it seemed to suggest, again, this progressive thing that, government can manage the economy in times of crisis, at least, in ways that will benefit, or at least, maybe not benefit Americans. They weren't too happy about having their food and fuel supplies cut, but serve a collective purpose, in this case, a purpose of defeating Germany and winning World War I. The Railroad Administration, government assumed control of all the railroads, of these private industries in 1917. Again, with the purpose of being able to mobilize for war and fight war. But the central agency for American World War I efforts was the War Industries Board, the WIB, who ran for about a year and a half between 1917 and 1919. If the U.S. economy was ever under the control of one individual, it was during the War Industries Board years under Bernard Baruch. Baruch was given extraordinary powers as a part of the War Industries Board. You'll be reading about the War Industries Board, not so much in the World War I chapter as you will be reading about it in the New Deal chapter, for reasons that we'll talk about when we do the New Deal lecture. All right. But Baruch, as head of the WIB, was given extraordinary power. The major goal of the War Industries Board was to act as a middleman between the U.S. Army, Navy, no Air Force, Marines, to kind of act as a go-between between private industry and the U.S. military to negotiate contracts. And so that was kind of the main job of Baruch and the WIB, but they were given powers alongside with that. They could set prices on basic materials like iron, lumber. Baruch and the War Industries Board set prices on what that would cost, particularly if you were selling you're part of a defense contract. Baruch could set prices on that stuff. He had the power, and the War Industries Board had the power to strong arm companies if they refused to work with the U.S., refused to work supplying the U.S. One of these stories came up with Baruch's relationship with Henry Ford. Ford initially had worked with Baruch and the War Industries Board to convert his Ford plants over to military production. And Baruch kind of after the first year is like, hey, Ford, thanks for what you did for us. We need you to convert 100% of your industry over to, of your, your wonderful assembly line, convert 100% of that over to wartime production. And Ford didn't want to do that. He wanted to keep making Model Ts for domestic consumption. He's like, all right, Bernie, as people called him, Bernie, here's what we'll do. I'll give you 50% of production. How about that? And Brooks says, okay, that's fine. I'm going to cut your coal and your steel supplies. So go ahead and make your 50% domestic cars without any steel and without any coal to fire your plants. Go ahead and do that. And Ford's like, oh, you wanted 100%. Okay, I didn't understand you. Sure, we'll give you what you want, Bernie. And so at times Bernie had to strong arm, or Bernie did strong arm Henry Ford. Again, this seemed to suggest this kind of Teddy Roosevelt control over the economy with the goal of accomplishing a greater purpose, in this case, the purpose of winning World War I, seemed to be confirmed by World War I. It seemed that the government can do this. Government by Bernie works. Okay, not Bernie Sanders, but Bernard Baruch, a very different Bernie. But honestly, this is where progressivism, and the War Industries Board, as it seemed to confirm progressive ideals of government control or management of the economy, also changed the meaning of that. What we see is a shift during these years away from language of control and toward the language of cooperation. What should be the ideal relationship between government and economy? Roosevelt had talked about control. Government needs to control the economy. Under Baruch and the War Industries Board and during World War I, we see a shift in the meaning of progressivism away from control and towards businesses and government cooperating with each other. The reality is that Baruch did not have to strong arm. The Ford story was an extraordinary one. For the most part, people were more than happy to work with Baruch in supplying the AEF and securing these defense contracts, because, well, just like today, back then, nobody paid better, or Baruch made sure that nobody paid better than the U.S. government. And so people were falling all over themselves trying to get a hold of these defense contracts. Baruch set prices high on steel, lumber. So, if you were a producer in these products, you made a lot of money off of World War I. But even if you're producing manufactured goods like, Jeeps and weapons and what have you, because of the introduction of cost-plus contracts, you saw significant profit. As one defense contractor would say, well, we're all making more money. This is a quote from the time. We're all making more money off of this thing than anyone should. It was obscene that to many Americans that they were making as much money as they were off of supplying the U.S. military and ultimately securing our victory in World War I. Cost plus contracts, they can be explained if you understand what the opposite is. Fixed plus contract. Say you sign a contract with Bernard Baruch, a fixed plus contract. All right, we're going to pay you $20 million to deliver us 5 destroyers. What if it ends up costing you, something happens that costs you more than $20 million to deliver those destroyers to the U.S. military? Well, sucks to be you, right? It's a fixed contract. So we're going to pay the $20 million, and if your cost overruns, if you had a lot of cost overruns, well, you got to eat those losses, less profits for you, right? Cost plus contracting is the government promised to pay the cost of what it actually produced to actually cost to make those destroyers, plus a guaranteed profit on top of that. Cost plus contracting is what really led the United States then and now to really pad the pockets of defense contractors. And this is kind of a very standard modern practice of cost plus contracting, which benefits companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and other industries that supplied the U.S. military. That's all beginning here in World War I, thanks to Bernard Baruch. Because Baruch was ultimately, he didn't want to strong arm American businesses. He wasn't a progressive. He doesn't believe in this ideal of trust busting and controlling corporations and controlling the economy. He wanted to to develop a different relationship between business and industry. And so Baruch's ideal was not government control of corporations. Baruch's ideal was really government cooperation with corporations and fostering cooperation of corporations with cooperation between corporations with each other. The ideal of the War Industries Board was for industries that were all involved in, if you were involved in steel production and selling of steel, marketing of steel, same with, food, same with making military uniforms. The ideal was you would form trade associations. The idea of a trade association was everybody, all businesses that were a part of a particular related industry should associate with each other. This was an ideal of business self-regulation. Trade associations should have regular meetings where they get together to talk about pricing and production and distribution and marketing and all these kinds of things. And the ideal is, as like say everybody in wheat or everybody in steel or everybody in coal worked together with each other rather than competing with each other, that this would make the economy more efficient, but also more prosperous as well too. Maybe we could even solve some of those problems of overproduction as businesses, rather than being controlled by the government, businesses kind of worked with each other. And as these industries formed trade associations, then government could come along and rather than having to work with all the separate parts of the wheat industry or the steel industry, government could work with these trade associations in a cooperative kind of way. That could help these industries, rather than busting them or controlling them, could help these industries actually succeed and thrive in ways that would make profits for the industries themselves, but ultimately would be beneficial for the American people as well too. And so understand what's going on here is that progressivism, the War Industries Board in World War I, is confirming a progressive ideal of government management of the economy, but it's also changing that ideal away from control and trust busting and towards government and towards businesses cooperating with each other and government cooperating with those businesses as they cooperated with each other. This is what historians in the 1960s would ultimately call corporate liberalism. A particular kind of liberalism in the United States, one that ultimately not just accepts that large private corporations are going to be the primary economic forces in American life, not only accepts that, but a government regime which actually encourages, actually supports corporations to become larger, to become more profitable. And so these historians of the 60s would say, the real legacy of progressivism is not restoring economic competition or busting corporations. The real legacy of the progressive movement is making America's corporate regime larger, more normal, more profitable. In other words, government-benefited corporations. Well, if that's true, if that corporate liberal concept or ideal is the right way to talk about what happened, it's not so much because of progressivism itself as much as how progressivism was changed by people like Bernard Baruch during World War I. Is it true the War Industries Board actually did what it said it did? Everybody celebrated the War Industries Board as an amazing success of government, enlightened government cooperation in the economy, cooperation with corporations, everybody thought that that was successful, and an ideal of trade associations, associationalism as it was called, became the norm of the 1920s and even into the 1930s and the New Deal, as we will see and you will read about. So clearly, progressivism, if it began with an ideal of busting corporations and restoring economic independence for Americans, it ended up in a very different place, right? For all the trust busting that went on before 1920, after 1920, there would be almost no trust busting. I think there was, for all of the thousands of corporate mergers that took place in the 1920s, only one was actually busted. And even in our own day, with all the large corporations, banks that we have today, there's almost no antitrust action going on whatsoever. So it's true where kind of progressivism began and where it ended up were two very different places. It is true when we look at the War Industries Board that production increased because of the War Industries Board by 20%. Americans did become more productive during these years because of government action. War Industries Board had encouraged the adoption of assembly line production, like Henry Ford had used, had encouraged that in other industries, and so Americans became more productive. We obviously became more profitable, as I talked about in the last lecture. We literally made a killing off of this war, selling to both sides, but mainly to selling to the British and the French. But the reality is the War Industries Board was only in effect for about a year and a half, and we were really only involved in World War I for about 2 years or so. So if this had gone on for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, would you have seen the same kind of success? It's hard to say, but it is true that people celebrated the War Industries Board as a great time of government involvement in the economy, and they believed that this was an ideal moving forward, but an ideal that was very different from, say, where progressivism had started out. So again, if you're kind of keeping track economically, World War I seemed to confirm but also change the meaning of progressivism away from trust busting and towards a new ideal of government cooperating with large corporations. To bring profits to corporations, sure, but the hope was also to make life better for Americans as well, too. You can be the judge of whether that's happened or not. Some other changes that came about because of World War I. Many labor organizations had been asking for some time for the government to take a more active role in supporting worker rights. And you saw a little bit of that movement with Teddy Roosevelt, coming in on the side of the coal strike in 1902. And so there is that kind of push in progressivism there for government to take a more active role in protecting not just the rights of corporations, but protecting the rights of workers too. And you do see that movement during World War I with the formation of the National War Labor Board. After 1914, when Americans began ramping up production, American workers, particularly industrial workers, began going on strikes, thousands of strikes. And these strikes threatened America's war effort, its ability to successfully supply our allies and supply our own troops in winning World War I. And so rather than just kind of strong arm workers, as had been done in the 19th century, break up the strikes and force them back to work, the government did create the National War Labor Board with the goal of supporting workers' rights. And you saw, it's only there for about a year, but you did see some unprecedented moves, things that progressives and socialists had been arguing for decades. For about a year, they get. If you worked in the defense industry, for instance, there were social insurance programs developed. If you ended up sick or injured, there was insurance for you. Again, before that time, if you were a worker who got sick or hurt, look, you don't work, you don't get paid. at least for a time in certain industries, a social insurance, a kind of unemployment insurance, a kind of sick or disability insurance was developed there for a time. Other significant, too, was the passage of equal pay for women, because women were working, as men went to fight in the war, more women were entering into the defense, into defense industries and working in industrial factories, and so the National War Labor Board passed an equal pay for women. If a guy's going to get paid $1 an hour for making Jeeps on the assembly line, a woman's going to get paid $1 too for making Jeeps on the assembly line. So some significant progressive pieces of legislation in effect here. The National War Labor Board also investigated companies where workers were going on strike, or just calling attention to injustices, not holding to standards. I think an 8-hour day also went into effect by the National War Labor Board, and where factories were not keeping their promises, workers striked, and the National War Labor Board came in and investigated, and if it was true that there were bad labor practices going on there, the National War Labor Board punished those corporations. Again, a government that sided not just simply with business, but was sided with labor, was a significant, even if it was very temporary. It did establish a precedent that in times of crisis, government is going to not just help out corporations, but government is going to help workers as well too. It's short-lived, but one of the consequences of World War I and the National War Labor Board is at least one labor union, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. If you've heard this term before, it's probably because being in a place like Detroit, you should hear of a place like the AFL-CIO, right? Where does the AFL come from? It comes from these progressive years of the 1890s and really become a normalized labor union because of World War I and into the 1920s. If labor unions were accepted as a normal part of American life, the AFL was first, representing primarily skilled, privileged workers, and that would be as a consequence of how AFL managed World War I and also worked with groups like the National War Labor Board. What's the CIO stand for in AFL-CIO? Well, we'll talk about that in a future lecture, okay? The 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving women a right to vote in national elections, was entirely a consequence of World War I. For a couple of reasons. Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, did not support a national amendment for women to be able to vote in the federal government, but women were able to capitalize upon World War I in a couple of ways. One way is women went to Wilson to say, look at all of these women and look at how they've stepped into defense industry. They're literally helping to build American weapons of weapons of mass and what's my catch? Weapons of little and mass destruction. There we go. I'm forgetting my common phrase. Women are building weapons of little and mass destruction here. How can you say that they don't deserve a greater piece of public life? And Congress would be very motivated by that. But it's also groups like the National Women's Party of Alice Paul and the protests that they engaged in during the war, calling out American hypocrisy, right? This was the war to make the world safe for American democracy. So Alice Paul and the National Women's Party stood in front of the White House, for instance, holding signs saying, fighting for democracy abroad. We don't have democracy here in the United States. You're fighting for democracy abroad. Women can't vote in the United States. They can't vote for the president of the United States. They can't vote for Congress. How is this democratic? And through these kinds of protests, through the involvement of women in the American workforce, Woodrow Wilson changes his mind. He encourages Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. Congress passes it. It is ratified by the states. The 19th Amendment to the Constitution. Women now have a right to vote in elections. Is that a fulfillment of progressivism? In many ways, increased worker rights was something that most progressives had argued for, and World War I did increase worker rights, at least on a temporary basis. What about women's rights? Was that a progressive ideal? It probably depends on what progressive you're talking about, right, and when you're talking about them. For Jane Addams and the Settlement House women, yeah, this was a central part of progressivism, was increasing political rights for women. For Teddy Roosevelt, well, it depends on when you ask him, right? Obviously, in the 1890s, when he's first kind of entering into politics, he doesn't believe women should have the right to vote. By the time he's head of the Progressive Party in 1912, it's like, yeah, of course women should have the right to vote. He supports that. Woodrow Wilson, depending when you ask him, when he's first president of the United States, no, women should not have a right to vote. By the end of that, women should have the right to vote. And so, was the 19th Amendment a fulfillment of progressive ambitions for women to have a greater political stake in America, or was that a kind of subversion of progressivism? And again, it depends on who you're talking to. Certainly for Jane Addams and these new women of the settlement houses, this is exactly what they had been arguing for some time, is that women should have a right to vote, commensurate to the social responsibilities that they had taken on. And then final subject is the changing place of African Americans in American life. You know, a question that students ask or should ask themselves during the Jim Crow era is like, you know, if the South was such a racially violent, racially suppressive place, why didn't African Americans just leave, right? Did they not have the freedom to like pack up and just move? And of course, the question is, well, where are they going to go? Like where is the place that African Americans are going to go after they leave the South, that they're somehow going to find more opportunities or more freedoms, or less racial oppression? Like, where is this place that's going to happen? And the question, there was no place until World War One. In World War I, with opening of new employment opportunities, particularly in the North and the Midwest, this is when you begin to see African Americans finally having a reason and purpose for moving out of the South. So it's kind of push and pull factors, right? Increased racial violence against African Americans, and that increased during World War I. The number of lynchings skyrocketed during World War I. So it's partly push factors of fleeing racial oppression, but it's also the pull factors of new job opportunities being opened in the North and Midwest. We begin to see what historians call the Great Migration. African Americans leaving not by the hundreds or the thousands, but literally by the hundreds of thousands, leaving the South, moving into the North, moving into the Midwest for these new employment opportunities. Between 1914 and 1917, an estimated 300,000 African Americans would leave the Deep South and move into places like Harlem in New York, Detroit in Michigan, you've heard of it, and of course Chicago. Now they did encounter, they did encounter all kinds of resistance, not so much in Harlem, but in Chicago, for instance. There were race riots in 1919 as Chicago's black population was increasing. Nevertheless, they continued to come by the hundreds of thousands through the war years. We'll see World War II would spark an even greater migration of African Americans into the North and Midwest. A couple things about the Great Migration, and we'll close on this. I've highlighted this as an economic move on the part of African Americans, right? They're leaving for these job opportunities. They really understood it as a religious move. They understood it as leaving Egypt and moving into the Promised Land. Yeah, I know Detroit and New York City might not exactly be the Promised Land of biblical proportions, but it was for Black Southerners. And so the migrants were organized by churches and pastors. As they came, they developed new hymns and songs about, again, leaving Egypt, coming to the Promised Land, enjoying new God-given freedoms to them. So this was really a religious movement of African Americans from the South into the North and the Midwest. The other question is, was the Great Migration, was it a fulfillment or a subversion of progressive ideals? And I think we have to conclude it 100% was a subversion, right? Most progressive reforms, and separate but equal, Jim Crow was considered to be a progressive reform. I know that might surprise you, but it was considered a part of progressivism during these years. Right, the whole point of Jim Crow and disfranchisement was really to erase African Americans as a part of the American story, or as a part of the new America, or the new nationalism. We saw that all over the first chapter of Gerstle and Roosevelt, right? African Americans fought at San Juan Hill. They helped secure victory in the Spanish-American War. And what does Roosevelt do? He doesn't even, he writes them out of that history. He doesn't even suggest that African Americans actually fought in that conflict. And I think that that's a good example of the progressive ideal towards African Americans, which was to render them invisible. Well, the Great Migration does the opposite of that. It makes African Americans newly visible, not just as a marginalized Southern population, but now the Great Migration securing African Americans as a national population, as a urban population, as a population with new economic rights, new freedoms, new educational opportunities being provided by their moves. And you do not get the civil rights. Ultimately, when we get to World War II, we'll talk about the formation of the civil rights movement. I know we think of the civil rights movement as something that happens in the 1950s in the South, among kind of more rural and populations. In fact, the civil rights movement actually begins in the North, among urban Black populations. And that had everything to do with the Great Migration. It had everything to do with African Americans taking advantage of opportunities provided by the war to move north, to move west, and there to reestablish themselves as a part of the national story. So absolutely, progressivism and progressives like Teddy Roosevelt wanted to marginalize, if not erase, the accomplishments of African Americans. African American efforts during World War I would secure a place for them as a part of the national story, laying the foundations during World War II for the civil rights movement. Let me just say a little bit about where we're at in 1920, because this is where the material for midterm 1 ends. And it's a significant year, I think, in the formation of America 2.0. Out of the catastrophe that was America 1.0, ending in the Civil War, America had to rebuild. That's a prospect that begins almost immediately after the war ends. And when is it kind of first completed? When is there a sense that we really are this thing called America? We really are these things called Americans. We really have achieved a kind of sense of nationalism or national belonging. That's 1920. That's a consequence of the progressive movement. It's a consequence of World War I as well, too. There's nothing like a common enemy to build a sense of Americanness. There's nothing like a war, at least in American case, to increase our increase our profitability, our prosperity, to increase our economic power. It's just, it's amazing how World War I just changed the international dynamics. Just one fact. America entered into World War I the leading debtor nation in the world. We owed more money to any other country. We exit the world as the world's leading creditor nation. Now the world owes us money. Over the 20th century is probably going to become a century of substantial Americanization, or the so-called American century. But World War I really secured that legacy honestly sooner than many Americans were ready to accept it. We'll find, and you'll read after World War One, Americans they're not quite ready with Woodrow Wilson to assume international responsibilities, right? They're not quite there. And so the 1920s seems to be a kind of return to a kind of isolationism, even as American businesses continue to expand, especially into Western Europe. You can take my American diplomacy class if you want to in the fall if you want to learn more about kind of the international dimensions of what's going on. But what I want to stress is that out of the devastation of the Civil War by 1920, Americans had, for a variety of reasons, recovered. Not just recovered economically, but had accomplished things economically that nobody else had to that time, and had achieved a sense of national belonging and Americanness that was really unprecedented in our history at that time. We had never, I think, even definitely 1776 and definitely 1789. So few people believed in a national experiment at that time. By 1920. It's really a high point of American nationalism to that point in our history. Exclusionary? Absolutely. That's part of what Gerstl's getting at. You'll be reading about in chapter 3 about what exactly did it mean to be an American? Who exactly could be an American? I mean, if you thought the melting pot idea was regressive, nowhere near regressive as the 1920s. I mean, the thought in the 1920s is even Europeans couldn't become Americans, let alone Asians or Africans, or Southern Americans. So it's a very exclusionary sense of American nationalism, if not what Gerstle calls a racial nationalism. But it is still a strong sense of Americanness and American nationalism that has been achieved by that time. So ends the material for the first part of this, the first third of this course. See you on the other side.